It was set up, and it was the beginning of democracy. At first, every man could vote. Now, when I say man, you have to realize, at this point, the Virginia colony was more than 90% men. There were very few women. It wasn't until the end of the 1600s that men and women were fairly equal in number in the Virginia colony. At first, but they were, unlike the Spanish, who a lot of the Spanish married Indians, the people of the Europeans, the English who came to Virginia, did not tend to marry Indians. Now, John Wolfe was an exception, but the Virginians did not normally marry Indians. So a lot of the men in Virginia did without wives. Anyway, this began democracy in America. More colonials came in. They were told that you can have cheap land and you can get money from tobacco. Land was abundant and cheap. Well, what happened after a while, some of your men became rich while others became poor or remained poor. Now, we're going to run into a word that we're going to see used again, polarized. In this case, the word polarized means that there were the very, very rich and the very, very poor with nobody in between. Now, we're going to run into that word again before the Civil War, when you had people who were hard against slavery and people who were hard for it, and they could not agree. So they wound up killing 500,000 men before they finally decided, well, there'll be no more slavery. But that's jumping ahead of the story. But the word polarized came in. You had extreme rich at the top and extreme poor at the bottom. This was the way the Southern society began early in its history, and it was to remain that way until the 20th century. It was that way during the Civil War, before the Civil War, and for many years after. Your rich were very rich, your poor were very poor, and most of your people were very poor with nobody in between. Now, as a result of more and more people coming in, the rich and poor became suspicious of each other. And then the governor of Virginia, Governor Berkeley, said, no, only wealthy property owners could vote. Now, this became an issue that was to last a couple hundred years, because even when our Constitution was founded, even after we defeated Britain, a lot of states and counties had the law that only male property owners could vote, and in some cases specify only white male property owners could vote. They did not want the poor people voting. Again, they only wanted the best, the top of the line voting, and they believed that the property owners would make better laws and make for better government than the ordinary people. Again, folk, that's the way it was. That's not the way I believe it should have been, but that's the way it was at the time. Well, the poor people naturally rebelled. A man named Bacon Now, if you think I'm throwing a lot out, you keep in mind, if this were a normal college with dormitories, we take this class 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Or if it were in a weekday class, we teach it here on either Monday and Wednesday or Tuesday and Thursday. I'm trying to cover it in one day, what we normally cover it in 2. So, all right. Anyway, Bacon, all right, the rebellion between Bacon started out as a conflict with the Indians. Bacon, like a whole lot of other whites, had moved into territory that was reserved for the Indians. The governor of Virginia said, no, we promised the Indians you couldn't have this. Bacon said, well, we're going to take it anyway. So he collected arms. They fought. The governor of Virginia and the wealthy people became alarmed. Hey, what are these people going to do? So the war started out as a war over Indian issues, but then it became a class struggle between the rich and the poor. Well, the governor of Virginia thought, I'll call a special election. So he called a special election to the House of Burgess, and to his surprise, folks, Bacon and his men won almost all the seats. Now, if you think the election of 2016, which I think most of us was a surprise, had a surprise outcome, This election was a surprise. The Governor Berkeley of Virginia, all of a sudden Bacon and his men were in power, had the power of legislature. Well, the governor said, no, we're not going to recognize any laws you pass. So the rich and poor started fighting among themselves, and then Bacon died probably of dysentery, of some disease. The governor of Virginia hung 13 of Bacon's followers, but the problem was the king heard about it. The king said the governor is dealing too hard with our people. So the king sent another governor, and Governor Berkeley was replaced. And the rich and poor made some kind of an uneasy truce with each other. But, folks, this was the beginning of what was to lead to rebellion. It was the first rebellion of one class against another in the New World, and eventually it was believed this was the forerunner of the rebellion against Great Britain. Now, in Florida, what I'm about to teach you was not taught to me, but let's face it, Florida and New Mexico are part of the United States, so we're going to include them. Your book does, and yeah, I think they should be. Florida and the United States were Spanish at the time. Now, catch this close. The Spanish could not get their people to move into either territory. Oh, by the way, New Mexico included what is today Arizona. It was split up eventually, but. And the governor of, I believe, of New Mexico complained, all that comes in here is a bunch of lazy, worthless bums who want to sit around and loaf all the time. Can you get somebody in here who has industriousness about him? But only the bums or the lazy people would come in. And that's ironic in view of the fact that today we're trying to keep these people out, whether it's right or wrong. I'm just stating a fact. We are trying to keep these people, this morning it made national news, about 300 of them tunneled under the wall, under what little wall exists, tunneled to get in. Any of you heard about this by any chance? Anyway, 300 of them made a tunnel and crawled under the wall, out of sight. But in those days, the Spanish could not get them to move in, neither could the Mexicans, so the Indians outnumbered them more than 20 to 1. The Indians did not want to convert. Nevertheless, some of the Indians were rounded up and forced to pay taxes and build churches. But eventually the Indians revolted and they killed most of the Spanish. And New Mexico was to remain independent. Now, New Mexico was to remain independent during the time the Spanish held the area. Then the Mexicans revolted against Spain, and they still could not conquer the Indians. But to jump into the story, the Americans took over. In the early 1800s, after the Mexican War, the Americans came in such numbers that it overwhelmed the Indians. The Americans were willing to come in. The Spanish and Mexicans were not. This image you get of the lazy Mexican, that was a lot of the picture that we get of Mexicans this time. And as for Florida, most of the people who lived in Florida lived in the northern part of Florida. If you've ever wondered why Tallahassee is the capital, and Tallahassee is right on the North Florida border, it's because for many generations the rest of Florida, the peninsula, was nothing but unused wasteland and looked on as being good for nothing. That may surprise you because today that area has Disney World and Miami and Naples and whatever else, all these beaches, Daytona Beach, and even Cape Canaveral. But at that time, Florida was mostly the northern part, and the rest of it was looked on as being unused wasteland, full of rattlesnakes and alligators and whatever else. And the Spanish simply could not police it, could not handle it, and eventually in 1819 Spain sold it to the United States. But that's jumping the story a little bit. The West Indies, much of the work in the West Indies was done with slave labor, and in 1619, the first slaves came to Virginia. They came as indentured servants at first. 1619 was the same year that the House of Burgess was set up, and the same year that the first women came to Virginia. In other words, from 1607 to 1619, there were no English women in Virginia. And like I say, it was to be another 60 or 70 years before women and men were equal in number in the colony of Virginia. All right, and, now, next to Virginia is Maryland. The colony of Maryland was founded by a man named Lord Baltimore. Lord Baltimore was a Catholic, and the Catholics were being persecuted in England. So Lord Baltimore said, I'm going to found a colony. So he founded a colony next to the Virginia colony, the Maryland colony, which was supposed to be a haven for Catholics. However, he did not exclude Protestants, and Protestant and Catholic both came in. Eventually, the Maryland colony became a lot like the Virginia colony. So, now, I've got to jump ahead of the story a little bit. A lot of the Virginians hated the Catholics who moved to Maryland. And folk, I must say this because it's part of the story. There was a strong anti-Catholic sentiment that run throughout much of American history. I'm not going to sweep under the rug, and let me hasten to state, I do not approve of it and do not agree with it, but there were times when Catholics were forbidden from holding office, and times when Catholics were discriminated against. The Ku Klux Klan was not just against blacks putting themselves forward, they also were anti-Catholic. In the 1850s, there came a group of people called the Know Nothings. It was a political party that was also strongly anti-Catholic. The anti-Catholic sentiment reared its head for the last time that I remember. In 1960, I was 11 years old when a Catholic ran for President of the United States and won. John Kennedy was named. But his Roman Catholicism was a big issue with a lot of the voters. But again, hopefully, we have somewhat put this aside and we don't have as much anti-Catholic sentiment in the country as once was. Oh yes, now, and I mentioned it for a minute, indentured servants, then I'll close. A lot of people could not pay the passage. Pardon my hand scratching. A lot of young people who wanted to go could not pay the passage, so they would agree to have someone else, like the company would pay their fee to get over here, and they would promise to work for the company for maybe a period of 7 years, sometimes 10 years. And if they could last that long and work as indentured servant, then after that they were given a plot of land and they were considered free. But many of the white people who came in the Virginia and the Carolinas were indentured servants. This went on for some years, and the first blacks that were brought in 1619 officially were indentured servants. But the difference was the blacks were never turned loose when their period of servitude ran out. And they were, I read an article one time, they were not considered slaves at first, but gradually they lost more and more of their freedom until by the late 1600s, there was no question about it, they were in fact slaves. But the slavery was introduced to America, not all at once, but gradually over a long period of time. Slavery was introduced, and but at first there were indentured servants, and the difference between an indentured servant and the black, there was none at first. They were both worked really hard. But the white indentured servant would eventually get his freedom, and the black man never did.